Sunlight pours through 900,000 square feet of glass and lands across her face like something poured rather than shown. And for one suspended moment, just inside the entrance to the transept, she stops walking entirely. Because nothing in her 24 years has prepared her for a room this size built almost entirely out of light. It is the middle of July, 1851, high summer now. Weeks past the opening day crowds and the royal procession and the newspaper engravings of Queen Victoria cutting a ribbon under a canopy of silk. The great elm trees the builders enclosed whole rather than fell rise green and faintly absurd above her head. Their leaves catching the same white brilliance that falls across the crystal fountain at the center of the nave. 27 feet of pink glass throwing a fine cool mist into air that already smells of warm iron, fresh paint and crushed grass. Somewhere far down the length of the building, past a horizon of statuary and silk banners and the flags of nations she has never visited and never will, an organ is playing something stately enough to fill the whole vaulted hall at once, its notes arriving soft and slightly delayed, the way sound behaves inside a cathedral rather than a room. She has worn her good dress, a dark blue-grey stuff with a fitted bodice, laced that morning by her own hands in front of a cracked square of mirror glass in a room she shares with her husband and her small daughter. Her bonnet is trimmed with a ribbon she saved 4 weeks of household pennies to buy specifically for today, and she has practiced, more than once in that same cracked mirror, the particular composed expression she intends to wear for the whole of this occasion, chin level, eyes wide, the look of a woman equal to whatever wonder is about to be placed in front of her. Beside her, a young man in a dark coat too heavy for July stands with their daughter balanced on one hip, and neither of them says anything at all for the first several seconds, because there is nothing yet worth saying that would not diminish what they are looking at. Glass roof rising 3 stories above their heads. A 24-foot crystal fountain throwing rainbows into humid air. Marble statues arranged in avenues stretching farther than either of them has ever seen indoors. Machinery gleaming with fresh oil in the transept beyond, silk from Lion, and carpets from Turkey, and a diamond from India locked inside an iron cage strong enough, the newspapers have promised, to withstand a direct assault. It is, by any honest measure, the single most extraordinary interior either of them will ever stand inside in their entire lives, and for this one, unhurried minute at the threshold, before the crowd behind them presses them properly into the hall, that is the whole and complete truth of the morning. It will not remain the whole truth for very much longer. Under the glass, under the silk banners and the cooling mist of the fountain, under the particular composed expression she is still successfully holding on her own face, an entirely different day is already beginning to gather itself. One with its own weather, its own crush, its own reckoning with a body that did not sign a contract to spend an afternoon standing upright in July heat inside what is, when the ornamental language is stripped away, the largest greenhouse ever built by human hands. 6 million people will pass under this roof before the year is finished. On this particular Tuesday in the middle of July, something in the range of 20 or 30,000 of them will be standing inside it at once. And not one word on the admission ticket in her husband's coat pocket has mentioned, even in passing, exactly what that many bodies packed under glass in a heat wave are actually going to feel like by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This is Hyde Park, London in the summer of 1851, and the England gathered under this roof believes several things about itself that the coming hours will test rather more severely than anyone standing at this threshold currently expects. It believes, correctly, that it has built something no other nation on earth could have attempted. A single continuous span of iron and glass covering 19 acres, raised in under 6 months from a design its own architect reportedly sketched on a piece of blotting paper during a railway board meeting. It believes, with rather more confidence than the evidence will ultimately support, that it has solved the problem of bringing several tens of thousands of ordinary bodies together under a single roof for an entire summer without giving those bodies anything approaching adequate water, air, shade, or sanitation. And it believes, perhaps most fervently of all, in the idea currently being tested for the first time in British history on a scale this large, that admitting the labouring poor into a great national spectacle, at £1 a head rather than the 5 shillings charged on the grander days, will produce nothing worse than curiosity and gratitude, when a great many of the gentlemen who organised this exhibition privately expected, and quietly prepared for, something considerably closer to a riot. Under all of that, under the crystal fountain and the marble statuary, and the particular quality of light no visitor to Hyde Park that summer ever quite managed to describe to their own satisfaction afterward, the story of a single day inside the great exhibition is far more complicated, far more physically demanding, and far more human than any engraving of the opening ceremony will ever let on. Before we go further, if this is the kind of history you actually want, the version that keeps the wonder intact while also telling you honestly what the postcard left out, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep doing the research a story like this one actually requires. And if there is a particular year or a particular spectacle you would like to see taken apart this same way, leave it in the comments below. I read every one of them. The great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, to give it its full and rather breathless official title, opened on the 1st of May, 1851. The brainchild of Prince Albert and the civil servant Henry Cole, and housed inside a structure so unlike anything London had previously built that the satirical magazine Punch gave it the name that stuck permanently within days of the announcement, the Crystal Palace. Joseph Paxton, the gardener turned architect who had spent years perfecting glasshouse design for the Duke of Devonshire's estate at Chatsworth, scaled that same greenhouse logic up to a building nearly 19 acres in area, more than 1/3 of a mile long, tall enough at its central transept to enclose a stand of mature elm trees without felling a single one of them. It was, everyone involved understood correctly, a genuine marvel of prefabricated iron and industrial glass, assembled from standardized parts with a speed that astonished visiting engineers from across Europe. What almost nobody involved in its planning appeared to have reasoned through with equal care was what that same structure, built almost entirely from the one material best known for trapping heat, would actually do to the people standing inside it once an English summer arrived in earnest. That is the story this evening is going to tell. Not the ribbon cutting, and not the diamond in its cage, although both of those will make their appearance before we are through. This is the story of what an ordinary body, dressed the way 1851 required it to be dressed, endured over the course of a single admission ticket. The heat that climbed toward the temperature of a greenhouse, because that is precisely what the building was. The crush of 30,000 strangers moving through aisles never designed to hold them. The thirst nobody had adequately planned for. The queue for what London newspapers would soon be calling, with genuine astonishment, the first public flush toilets most of the people using them had ever seen in their lives. It is the story of a nation that had just convinced itself it could organize anything, discovering, one warm Tuesday afternoon at a time, exactly how much organizing an ordinary crowd of human bodies actually requires. Let us begin, as the day itself began for a great many of the people who attended it, not with the diamond or the fountain, but with the family who had spent the better part of 2 months careful saving simply to be standing at this threshold at all. Her name is Eliza Marsh, and she is 24 years old, born in Bethnal Green to a family of silk weavers in a trade that has been dying, slowly and without much ceremony, for the better part of her entire lifetime. Her father wove figured silk on a handloom in a garret room built with the long, low windows that let in maximum light for exactly this purpose. A trade that had once supported entire streets of Spitalfields families in something close to comfort, and that now, undercut year after year by cheaper machine-woven imports and by silk arriving from France under trade terms Eliza's father can recite. From memory, and still cannot entirely explain, supports considerably fewer of them, and those it does support rather less comfortably than it once did. Eliza herself, trained as a needlewoman rather than a weaver, took in fine sewing and mending from a draper's shop off Bethnal Green Road, and married, 3 years ago, a journeyman cabinet maker named Thomas Marsh, who works in a furniture workshop near Curtain Road in Shoreditch, a trade with its own long hours and its own occupational hazards, though considerably better wages than her father's loom has produced in a decade. Thomas is 27, broad through the shoulders in the particular way of a man who spends his days planing and lifting hardwood with permanently roughened hands and the faint, not unpleasant smell of linseed oil and French polish that no amount of washing before an outing ever quite removes from his skin. He owns one good coat, dark wool, worn today despite the heat, because a family outing to see the exhibition is, by the unspoken standards of respectable working London, precisely the kind of occasion that calls for a man's best coat, regardless of what the thermometer happens to be doing. His one small private habit, the thing he does without ever having named it to himself as a habit, is to chew a leaf of mint pulled from a pot on their windowsill before he leaves the workshop each evening, a private, mostly unconscious effort to carry a little less of the polished shop into the room where his wife and daughter are waiting for him. He carries their daughter Anne, 4 years old, against his hip as they cross the threshold into the transept, and Anne, who has talked of almost nothing else for a fortnight, is currently too overwhelmed by the size of the room to produce any of the questions she has clearly been saving up for the occasion. There is one further fact about this particular July morning that Eliza has told no one outside her own household, and that she has, in truth, only half admitted to herself. She is some 10 weeks along with a second child, early enough that nothing yet shows under the boned bodice of her good dress, early enough that she has not yet worked out the correct moment to tell her own mother, and entirely far enough along that the mild, persistent nausea she has been managing since June has already made itself known to her on the walk from Bethnal Green this morning, a small private weather system moving through her body that has nothing whatsoever to do with the heat, and that the heat, as the day wears on, is about to make considerably worse. She has said nothing of this to Thomas beyond what he already knows. She intends to enjoy this day regardless, because a day like this one, an entire admission ticket's worth of wonder set aside from the ordinary grinding calendar of washing and mending and worry over her father's dwindling loom work, comes perhaps once in a working woman's whole life, and she does not intend to let an unsettled stomach take it from her before it has properly begun. They rose before 5 that morning in their rooms off Bethnal Green Road, dressed with real care, and walked the better part of the distance to Hyde Park rather than pay omnibus fare they had already budgeted toward the day's other necessary expenses, arriving at the park gates with 2 hours still to spare before the doors opened to the general public at the shilling rate. Eliza had pinned her ribbon into place the night before rather than risk fumbling it in the morning rush, and Thomas had brushed his good coat until the nap lay flat and even, and both of them had told Anne more than once over the preceding fortnight that today they were going to see the most wonderful room in the entire world. Standing now just inside the transept, sunlight falling in sheets through 900,000 square feet of glass overhead, the crystal fountain throwing its fine cool mist into the warming air. That particular promise is, for this one unhurried minute, exactly and completely true. What none of the three of them yet understand, though Eliza's stomach and Thomas's collar are both already beginning to offer some quiet early evidence, is precisely how much the rest of the day is going to ask of them in exchange for it. If you picture the crowd arriving at the gates of the great exhibition on an ordinary shilling day, you probably imagine something close to a church congregation filing in for a Sunday service, a long but essentially orderly line moving forward at a steady, predictable pace, families waiting their turn with the patient good manners the Victorian imagination likes to assign to itself by default. That picture holds up reasonably well for perhaps the first hour of any given morning, and falls apart rather more quickly than most visitors expected the moment the doors themselves actually opened. The actual mechanics of admission at Hyde Park in the summer of 1851 involved a set of turnstiles and ticket barriers that had been designed, with genuine care, to process a large crowd efficiently, and that were nonetheless being asked, on the busiest shilling days, to process a volume of arriving visitors that ran into the tens of thousands within the space of a few opening hours. From the 26th of May, admission on Monday through Thursday had been fixed at 1 shilling a head. A deliberate and largely successful piece of civic engineering meant to widen access to the exhibition well beyond the wealthy season ticket holders and the 5-shilling Saturday crowd. And the change in attendance was immediate and dramatic. Where the earlier, costlier admission days had drawn a comparatively genteel crowd moving through the building at a leisurely pace, the shilling days drew working London in numbers the turnstiles had never been tested against. Clerks and cabinet makers and needlewomen and silk weavers arriving by omnibus, on foot, and in hired carts shared between several families at once, all of them converging on the same handful of entrances within roughly the same 2-hour window each morning. Eliza, Thomas and Anne joined that convergence a little before 7, and the 2 hours they had budgeted as a comfortable margin proved to be very nearly consumed entirely by the walk itself and the wait that followed it. The approach to the park from the eastern gates was already thick with pedestrians by the time they arrived, a slow-moving river of dark coats and pale summer dresses funneling toward the same few points of entry, and the crowd thickened further with every few hundred yards until forward movement became less a matter of walking and more a matter of being carried gently along by the mass of bodies around them. Thomas kept Anne on his hip rather than risk her being separated from them at ankle height, a precaution that would prove considerably more necessary than he yet understood, and Eliza found herself, within the first quarter hour of standing in the queue proper, already fighting the particular swimming, unsettled sensation her stomach had been offering her since the walk from Bethnal Green, made noticeably worse by the tight press of unmoving bodies on every side and by a morning sun that had not yet reached anything like its full strength. What made the crush at the gates truly alarming, rather than merely uncomfortable, was less the number of people involved than the specific physics of what happens when that many people are funneled toward a narrow point, all wanting, understandably, to reach it as quickly as possible. Contemporary accounts of the exhibition's busier mornings describe exactly this pattern repeating itself at gate after gate. A crowd arriving faster than the turnstiles could process it, building pressure at the barrier itself until the people nearest the front found themselves pressed forward by the accumulated weight of everyone behind them, unable to step back, unable to hurry the mechanism ahead of them, simply absorbing the pressure until the line inched forward enough to release it. The commissioners overseeing the exhibition had, to their genuine credit, arranged for a substantial expansion of the ordinary metropolitan police presence specifically to manage exactly this kind of crowd, with the chief commissioner requesting and receiving something in the range of 1,000 additional constables for the duration of the exhibition. Officers stationed at every gate and along every principal approach road specifically to prevent the kind of crush that had marred other large London gatherings in living memory. Their presence helped considerably. It did not, and could not, eliminate the basic problem of a turnstile designed to admit a modest, steady stream of visitors being asked, some mornings, to admit something closer to a flood. Anne, small enough to be really invisible to anyone standing directly beside her, came within a few frightening seconds of being separated from her parents entirely during the worst of the crush near the barrier itself, when a sudden surge from behind pressed the family sideways against a stranger's shoulder hard enough that Thomas, gripping his daughter with one arm and Eliza's hand with the other, found himself momentarily unable to do both at once. He chose his daughter instinctively and without a second's hesitation, and called Eliza's name loudly enough to be heard over the general noise of the crowd, and the two of them found each other again within perhaps 10 seconds, though Eliza would later describe those 10 seconds, in the version of the day she told her own mother, as the only part of the morning that had honestly frightened her. It was not, in the end, an unusual experience. Newspaper correspondence and the Commissioner's own internal reports from across the exhibition's run describe repeated incidents of exactly this kind. Children briefly separated from parents in the press near the gates, a problem serious enough that lost child announcements became a routine, near daily feature of the exhibition's operation, handled by attendants stationed specifically to reunite bewildered small children with the adults frantically searching for them. Once through the barrier itself, the crowd did not so much disperse as redistribute, spreading out into the vast interior of the building with a relief that was almost physical in its intensity, the sheer scale of the transept finally offering room to breathe after the compressed misery of the queue outside. For a family like the Marshes, this moment of arrival, sunlight falling through the glass roof, the crystal fountain throwing its cooling mist, the crowd finally loosening into something closer to a comfortable density, would have felt, and by every honest account truly did feel, like a kind of triumph, the successful completion of a difficult passage into somewhere wonderful. Eliza's nausea eased somewhat in the more open air of the transept, and Anne finally sat down on her own feet, spun in a slow circle taking in the size of the room with an expression her mother would remember fondly for years afterward. The broader context worth naming plainly here concerns exactly how much confidence the organizers of the exhibition had invested in the building itself, and how comparatively little they had invested in the mechanics of simply getting people into it. The historian Geoffrey Auerbach, whose study of the exhibition remains the standard scholarly account of how the event was actually organized and experienced, has written at length about the genuine anxiety felt by the exhibition's aristocratic organizers in the weeks before the Shilling Days began. Anxiety rooted less in practical crowd management than in a barely disguised fear of what admitting the laboring classes to a building full of valuable exhibits, at a price they could actually afford, might provoke. That fear proved, in the event, almost entirely unfounded, a fact the organizers themselves would eventually concede with something close to genuine surprise, what it had not adequately prepared for, because it was not the danger anyone in a position of authority had spent much time worrying about, was the considerably more mundane physical hazard of simple crowd density at a barrier never designed to admit this many working Londoners in this shorter window of time. There is something worth sitting with in the gap between those two anxieties, the one the exhibition's planners actually prepared for: extra constables, a substantial military presence held in careful reserve, contingency plans against theft and disorder that were, in the end, almost entirely unnecessary, and the one they had given comparatively little organized thought to at all: the straightforward physical reality of what happens to small children, pregnant women, and anyone else without the size or strength to hold their ground when tens of thousands of eager, respectable, perfectly law-abiding visitors all try to pass through the same narrow gate within the same short hour. Eliza and Thomas did not think of their morning in these terms. They thought of it, once safely inside and breathing more easily under the glass, as the first thoroughly difficult part of the day now successfully behind them. They were not entirely wrong. They were also, though neither of them yet fully appreciated it, only a very short way into a day that had considerably more of exactly this kind of difficulty still ahead of it, packed into a building that was, on this particular July morning, already beginning to warm. Which brings us to the question of what these bodies were actually wearing while they stood under all that glass. Because the crush at the gate was only the first layer of a problem that would follow every visitor through the length of the day. If you imagine Victorian summer dress, you probably picture something reasonably suited to warm weather: pale cottons and light straw bonnets, an outfit sensibly adjusted the way a modern summer wardrobe would be. For the small number of wealthy visitors able to afford the lightest fashionable muslins, there was some truth in that picture. For Eliza, Thomas, and the overwhelming majority of the working Londoners standing beside them that July, the actual reality bore very little resemblance to it at all. Eliza's dress, the dark blue-grey stuff she had laced herself into before dawn, was not an unusual choice for a working woman's best outfit, and it was not, by the standards of her own household budget, a foolish one either. Wool and the sturdy worsted blends generally called stuff held their shape and their colour far better across repeated wear than lighter cottons. Represented, for a family with essentially one good dress to its name, a very sensible long-term investment regardless of season, and carried, in the specific texture and drape, a respectable stuff dress produced. A set of social signals about thrift and propriety that mattered to Eliza rather more than her own comfort did on any given morning. Beneath the dress itself sat a corset boned with whalebone, laced firmly enough to produce the narrow, upright silhouette 1851 fashion still required of a respectable woman's figure. And under the corset, a chemise, and under the skirt, several layers of petticoat. Some of them stiffened to help the skirt hold its fashionable bell-shaped fullness without requiring quite so many separate layers of fabric to achieve the same effect. Stockings, wool or a wool blend even at the height of July, completed an outfit assembled almost entirely without reference to the actual temperature a body might encounter wearing it for the better part of a day indoors under a glass roof. Thomas's own clothing carried a comparable burden in a different register. His good dark coat sat over a waistcoat and a shirt with a stiff, high collar, an ensemble suited to a respectable outing and almost entirely unsuited to standing for hours in what was, by any honest description, an enormous heated glasshouse. Respectable Victorian dress for men and women alike was governed considerably less by seasonal comfort than by an elaborate, largely unspoken code of social presentation, one in which the correct silhouette and the appropriate degree of coverage mattered a great deal more than whether the wearer happened to be, at any given hour, uncomfortably warm inside it. By mid-morning, with the transept's air already carrying a noticeable weight it had not held at the doors, the physical cost of all this fabric had become truly difficult for Eliza to ignore. Wool holds heat against the skin the way a blanket does, trapping warmth rather than releasing it, and the corset underneath compounded the effect a great deal, restricting the natural expansion of her ribcage with every breath, and making the kind of deep, cooling exhale a body instinctively wants to take in heat almost physically impossible to achieve. Sweat gathered under the whalebone with no easy means of evaporating through layers of stuff, cotton, and stiffened petticoat, and the specific swimming lightheadedness she had been managing since the queue outside had begun, by late morning, to feel considerably less like ordinary nausea and considerably more like something the heat itself was actively producing. She said nothing about any of it to Thomas, beyond what she had already told him. There was, in the vocabulary available to a respectable young woman of her class and period, no entirely comfortable way to announce in a crowded public building that one's undergarments were making it difficult to breathe, and so she did. Quietly. What a great many women standing near her at that same moment were also doing, which was simply to endure it while continuing to smile for her daughter's benefit. The living historian Ruth Goodman, who has spent years actually wearing reconstructed period clothing through ordinary daily tasks in every season in order to understand it from the inside rather than merely describing it from behind museum glass, has written extensively about how genuinely punishing this kind of dress became in real summer heat, particularly for women whose corsetry restricted the deep breathing the body relies on to help regulate its own temperature. Goodman's own experiments wearing full Victorian dress through a hot summer day described symptoms strikingly close to what a woman like Eliza would have experienced that July: a persistent low-grade dizziness, an inability to properly cool down even while standing still, and a fatigue that accumulated steadily across hours rather than announcing itself all at once. Layered wool and whalebone were not an incidental discomfort bolted onto an otherwise sensible outfit. They functioned, worn directly against the skin for an entire day under a glass roof, as something close to a portable heat trap. And the fact that respectable society had collectively agreed to treat this as simply what correct dress required did nothing whatsoever to change what it was actually doing to the bodies wearing it. Anne, dressed that morning in a small cotton frock rather than her mother's heavier layers, fared considerably better by simple virtue of childhood fashion, asking less of small bodies than adult fashion asked of grown ones, though even she had grown flushed and fretful by late morning, tugged more than once by Eliza's free hand away from the densest. Warmest pockets of the crowd gathered around the more popular exhibits. Thomas, whose coat trapped heat in much the same way Eliza's dress did, tolerated it with rather more physical resilience, a working man's frame more accustomed to sustained exertion than the considerably more sedentary daily life, fashionable Victorian femininity generally required of women in Eliza's position, though even he found himself, by noon, quietly loosening his stiff collar a fraction whenever he judged no one of particular consequence was watching him do it. The broader context here says something fairly pointed about how differently Victorian society understood the relationship between clothing and the body compared with how we generally understand it now. Comfort, in anything resembling the modern sense of the word, was simply not a primary design consideration for respectable dress in 1851, and particularly not for women, whose clothing was understood first and foremost as a visible expression of moral character, social position, and feminine restraint, with physical ease treated as, at best, a secondary and faintly suspect concern. A woman who complained openly about the heat of her own corset risked being read as someone unable to bear the ordinary demands of respectable femininity, a judgment serious enough that most women, Eliza very much included, simply absorbed the discomfort in silence rather than risk inviting it. Wealthier visitors that summer had some real advantage in lighter, better-tailored fabrics and the option of resting in one of the exhibition's refreshment courts between exertions, but even fashionable summer muslin worn over the same foundational undergarments offered only a partial reprieve from a system of dress built around presentation rather than physiology. The heat, in this sense, was democratic in its cause and considerably less democratic in its effect, falling hardest on the visitors least able to escape either the July sun outside or a full day of standing and walking inside a building specifically designed, whatever else its architects had intended, to concentrate that same sun's warmth rather than disperse it. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that an entire building full of visitors spent a summer's day slowly overheating inside clothing chosen almost entirely for how it looked rather than how it felt, and did so without any particular sense that this represented a design failure rather than simply the ordinary cost of appearing correctly dressed in public. Eliza would not have described her own morning in those terms. Asked how she was enjoying herself, she would have said, honestly, that she was having a wonderful time. A little warm, perhaps, nothing worth remarking on. And she would have been telling the truth, because a wonderful time and a slowly overheating body were not, in her experience, or in the experience of nearly every other woman standing near her that morning, understood as contradictory conditions. They were simply what a day out looked like, worn on the body the way the era required a respectable woman to wear it. Whatever the thermometer happened to be doing on the other side of 900,000 square feet of glass. Now, the building itself, because the heat pressing down on Eliza's corset and Thomas's collar was not simply a matter of a warm July day. It was the direct and entirely predictable consequence of what the Crystal Palace actually was, a fact its own designer understood rather better than most of the visitors standing inside it that morning. If you imagine a building famous for letting in light, you probably imagine that light as a purely benevolent feature, glass chosen to make a space feel open and airy rather than heavy and enclosed. Joseph Paxton had, in fact, built his career designing greenhouses before he ever turned his attention to the Great Exhibition, most notably the enormous glass and iron conservatories he raised for the Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth, structures engineered specifically to trap warmth and humidity for the cultivation of delicate tropical plants through an English winter. The Crystal Palace was, in the most literal architectural sense available, that same design philosophy scaled up to nearly 19 acres and repurposed to hold people rather than orchids, and a building engineered to trap heat efficiently for the sake of tropical plant life does not stop trapping heat efficiently simply because the visitors standing inside it happen to be wearing wool rather than growing leaves. The exhibition's own organizers had, to their genuine credit, anticipated this problem well before opening day, drawing directly on the anxious experience of exhibitors who had already spent time inside comparable glasshouses, including the Palm House at Kew and the Great Conservatory in Regent's Park, both known among gardeners for becoming almost unbearably hot and humid on a sunny afternoon. Paxton's response was a system of several hundred wooden louvre boards set into the building's iron framework, designed to be opened and adjusted by hand several times a day to help regulate airflow through the structure, supplemented by canvas awnings stretched across sections of the glass roof to diffuse the most direct summer sunlight. From the 7th of July, with the heat of high summer bearing down in earnest, the commissioners went a considerable step further, ordering entire sections of glazing removed from the building's north and south facades to allow a more direct exchange of air between the overheated interior and whatever relief the outside atmosphere could offer, a decision that amounted, in practice, to a public admission that the original ventilation system had not proven adequate to the task it had been designed for. None of these measures, however well engineered, fully solved the underlying problem, because the underlying problem was a matter of simple physics rather than insufficient effort. The Royal Sappers and Miners, the specialist military engineering corps charged with monitoring and adjusting the building's ventilation, maintained a formal register of interior temperatures throughout the exhibition's run, reading 40 separate thermometers positioned across the building, 14 of which were checked and logged at 2-hour intervals every single day between 9 in the morning and 6 in the evening, from the 19th of May through the 14th of October. Modern researchers who have gone back through that surviving register, including the architectural historian Henrik Schonefeld, whose detailed study of the Crystal Palace's environmental performance remains the most thorough scholarly account of exactly how the building actually behaved in real weather, have found the recorded interior temperatures to be, in the driest possible academic language, extremely unstable, climbing well above the outside air temperature on warm, sunny days despite every louvre board and canvas awning the sappers and miners could adjust. Newspapers covering the exhibition through that same summer commented repeatedly, and with growing exasperation, on exactly this problem, describing galleries in the building's more exposed sections as stifling by early afternoon on any properly hot day, an experience thousands of visitors were independently confirming with their own bodies at exactly the moment the papers were writing about it. For Eliza and Thomas, standing now well inside the building's central transept, with the July sun climbing toward its own daily peak, the lived experience of all this engineering and its limitations arrived less as a fact to be reasoned about, and more as a simple, cumulative physical weight. The air under the glass roof carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with humidity in the ordinary outdoor sense, and everything to do with tens of thousands of warm bodies adding their own steady contribution to an atmosphere already being heated from above by direct summer sun, through 900,000 square feet of glass. The louvre boards nearest them stood open, adjusted that morning by an attendant on a routine circuit of the gallery, and the effect, while real, was noticeably insufficient against the sheer volume of both sunlight and human warmth accumulating inside the structure by early afternoon. Eliza found herself, more than once, deliberately steering the family toward whatever patch of shade the crystal fountains mist or an overhanging gallery happened to offer. A small, constant, largely unconscious negotiation with a building that had been built, for all its brilliance, without her particular body's comfort, anywhere near the center of its design brief. The broader context worth naming here concerns exactly how much confidence Victorian engineering culture placed in its own solutions, and how much genuine trial and error actually lay hidden under that confidence once a structure this ambitious met real weather for the first time. The Crystal Palace was not a failure of engineering in any meaningful sense. It was a building whose designers had correctly identified the central problem, heat trapped under glass, and had engineered a plainly thoughtful set of countermeasures, louvres, awnings, removable glazing. A continuously monitored thermometer network, unlike almost anything attempted in a public building before it. What that same engineering could not fully overcome was the basic thermodynamic reality of a structure covering 19 acres in glass, standing directly under an English summer sun. A limitation no amount of adjustment to the louvre boards was ever going to entirely solve, and one the sappers and miners' own daily register, taken twice an hour for 5 straight months. Quietly and repeatedly confirmed. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the single most celebrated feat of engineering the 19th century had yet produced was also, on its hottest afternoons, functioning almost exactly as its architect's earlier glasshouses had functioned for the Duke of Devonshire's orchids. An enormous, brilliantly constructed machine for concentrating warmth filled that particular July with visitors dressed in wool and whalebone who had come specifically to admire it. The wonder of the building and the discomfort of standing inside it were not, in any real sense, two separate stories running alongside one another. They were the same physical phenomenon, observed from 2 different angles by the same 19 acres of glass roof, doing precisely what a roof built almost entirely from glass has always done to whatever stands under it in summer. A crowd, faced with a problem like that, tends to solve it for itself in whatever small, informal ways the building actually allows, and the marshes were no different from anyone else drifting, almost without deciding to, toward the coolest available corner of the transept. The mist thrown off the crystal fountain proved the single most sought-after relief in the entire building on a day like this one, and the ring of visitors standing close enough to feel its faint spray against their faces grew steadily denser as the morning wore into afternoon. A crowd within a crowd, gathered less for the fountain's considerable beauty at that point than for the 2 or 3 degrees of relief its cooling water actually offered. Eliza stood in that denser ring for a few minutes longer than she might otherwise have chosen to, Anne's small hand damp in her own, both of them turning their faces toward the fine drifting spray with an appreciation that had rather more to do with simple animal comfort than with any of the fountain's celebrated engineering. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what it would actually feel like to be thirsty inside a building this size, because thirst, more than almost anything else that happened to Eliza's family that day, is the discomfort that arrived earliest, lingered longest, and turned out to be entangled most directly with the state of the household's careful shilling budget. If you imagine refreshments at a great Victorian exhibition, you probably picture something reasonably plentiful, stalls scattered generously throughout the building, a visitor able to find a cool drink more or less whenever the need for one arose. The actual arrangement inside the Crystal Palace was considerably more restricted than that picture suggests, the result of a single exclusive contract awarded, after competitive tender, to the firm of Schweppes, which paid the exhibition's commissioners a substantial sum, something in the region of £5,000, for the sole right to sell food and drink anywhere inside the building. No alcohol of any kind was permitted on the premises, a decision the commissioners made deliberately, partly out of genuine concern for order among a crowd expected, on the busiest days, to number in the tens of thousands, and partly to reassure precisely the anxious segment of respectable opinion that had spent the months before opening day worrying aloud about what a shilling admission price might invite through the doors. Schweppes, in exchange for its exclusive concession, installed refreshment courts at intervals through the building, offering soda water, lemonade, ginger beer, tea, coffee, and a modest selection of solid food that leaned heavily, by the exhibition's own surviving accounts, on bath buns, sold in quantities that would strike a modern visitor as remarkable. More than 1 million bottles of soda water, lemonade, and ginger beer consumed across the 6 months of the exhibition's run, and very nearly as many buns alongside them. The trouble, for a family like Eliza's, was not the quality of what Schweppes was selling so much as its price and its distance. The refreshment courts, numerous as they were, still amounted to a finite number of fixed points inside a building nearly 1/3 of a mile long, meaning a visitor standing in the machinery court or admiring the sculpture gallery at the moment thirst became thoroughly pressing, might easily find themselves a considerable walk from the nearest counter, a walk made through crowds, in July heat, by a woman already managing both nausea and a laced corset. And the prices Schweppes charged, while not extravagant by the standards of a wealthy season ticket holder, represented a real and carefully weighed expense against a household budget that had already been stretched thin simply to afford 3 admission tickets and the day's other necessary costs. Thomas and Eliza had set aside a specific, modest sum for refreshments before ever leaving Bethnal Green that morning. A sum calculated with the same close attention Eliza applied to the family's weekly grocery accounts, and every glass of lemonade or ginger beer purchased across the length of the day represented a small, deliberate subtraction from that carefully fixed total rather than an impulse either of them felt free to indulge without a moment's mental arithmetic first, for visitors without even that modest sum set aside, or for those simply unwilling to queue at a crowded refreshment counter in the heat. An entirely separate and considerably less regulated food economy had sprung up just outside the exhibition's gates. A scattered collection of street vendors selling pies, sandwiches, fruit, and cold drinks to the crowds arriving and departing, at prices generally lower than anything available inside. This informal trade carried its own separate hazard, one that had nothing to do with Schweppes's exclusive contract and everything to do with the basic difficulty of keeping perishable food safe in direct summer heat with none of the refrigeration a modern visitor would take entirely for granted. Meat pies sold from an open cart or a hawker's tray, left standing in July sun for as many hours as it took to sell through a day's stock, carried a real and largely unregulated risk of spoilage. A hazard well understood in a general, cautionary way by working Londoners of the period, even without any formal science of food safety to explain precisely why a pie that smelled slightly off by mid-afternoon was worth avoiding, regardless of how hungry a visitor had become by then. Eliza, who had grown up watching her own mother judge the freshness of a market stall's wares by smell and by the particular give of a crust under a thumb, applied exactly that same practical caution to the pie cart Thomas eyed hopefully near the exhibition's eastern approach, and steered the family instead toward a Schweppes counter inside the building. A slightly costlier choice, she judged, correctly, to be the considerably safer one. By early afternoon, with the transept's air heavier than it had been at any point that morning, the family's carefully budgeted refreshment money had already gone toward 2 small glasses of lemonade. Purchased and shared between the 3 of them at a Schweppes counter near the machinery court, a modest indulgence that did rather less to fully quench Eliza's thirst than she had hoped, and considerably more to remind her of exactly how much further the day's remaining hours were going to demand of a body already managing heat, nausea, and the tight restriction of a corset that had begun, by this point, to feel less like a garment and more like a genuine physical adversary. She found herself rationing her own remaining thirst against the family's remaining budget with the same close mental accounting she applied to every other expense in her household, deciding, without ever fully articulating the decision even to herself, that Anne's evident and understandable thirst mattered rather more, in the balance of the afternoon's remaining shillings, than her own. The broader context worth naming plainly here concerns the specific and rather elegant piece of commercial engineering the exhibition's commissioners had constructed almost without anyone at the time remarking on it directly, a single exclusive concession, granted to a single respectable firm, at prices that firm was free to set without meaningful competition inside the building's walls, meant that thirst itself, one of the most basic and universal physical demands a body can make, became, for 6 months, a very stratified experience, more easily and more comfortably satisfied by visitors whose daily budgets could absorb the cost without a second thought, and rather more carefully rationed by visitors for whom every glass of lemonade represented a small, real subtraction from money that had already been allocated, in advance and in considerable detail, to getting a family safely to the exhibition and safely home again. The historian Liza Picard, whose research into the material texture of everyday Victorian London draws extensively on exactly this kind of household budgeting, has documented how tightly managed the finances of a working family typically were in this period. A precision that made even the smallest unplanned expense, a bun, a second glass of ginger beer, a truly meaningful decision rather than a trivial one. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that thirst, arguably the single most democratic physical sensation a crowded summer building could produce. Everyone under that glass roof was growing thirsty at roughly the same rate, in roughly the same heat, was nonetheless being managed by two entirely different sets of rules depending on which pocket a visitor happened to be reaching into. Eliza did not experience her own careful rationing as an injustice that particular afternoon. She experienced it, much as she experienced her corset and the crush at the gate, as simply the ordinary shape of a day out for a family in her position. A shape she had planned for in advance with real care and was now executing. Glass of lemonade by careful glass of lemonade, exactly as intended. The wonder of the building had not diminished. It had simply acquired, by early afternoon, a very specific and very concrete arithmetic running quietly alongside it. One that a wealthier visitor standing at the very same refreshment counter, ordering a second glass without a moment's hesitation, would very likely never have thought to notice at all. Which brings us to the question that nobody in a crowd this large and this respectable would have dreamed of asking out loud, and that a great many of them, Eliza included, were nonetheless quietly and increasingly urgently working out the answer to by early afternoon. If you imagine the sanitary arrangements at a major public building in Victorian London, you might reasonably assume they were modest, cramped, and none too pleasant, an unglamorous afterthought tucked away somewhere out of sight. What actually existed inside the Crystal Palace that summer was, in fact, something considerably more remarkable than that assumption allows, and its remarkable quality is precisely why it became, almost immediately, one of the most talked about features of the entire exhibition. A sanitary engineer named George Jennings had been granted, by the commissioners, the concession to install a set of retiring rooms inside the building, and what he built there amounted to the first public flush toilets most of the people using them had ever encountered in their lives. For the price of 1 penny, a visitor received the use of a clean water closet, a fresh towel, a comb, and, in a detail that struck contemporary observers as almost extravagant, a shoe shine besides. The fixtures themselves, elegant, mechanically ingenious, and by the standards of ordinary London plumbing at the time, really luxurious, earned an affectionate nickname among the men who installed and serviced them, borrowed from the trade's own working slang for a particular shape of valve assembly. And by the time the exhibition closed in October, something in the range of 827,000 separate visitors had paid their penny to use them. That figure is worth sitting with for a moment on its own terms, because it says something quite direct about the actual scale of ordinary bodily need inside a building this large, need that the exhibition's planners had, in this one specific respect, thought through with considerably more foresight than they had applied to ventilation or refreshment pricing. It is also, in a rather more oblique way, the likely origin of a phrase that has outlived nearly everything else about the exhibition in ordinary English speech. To spend a penny, meaning to visit the lavatory, is a euphemism most English speakers today use without any particular awareness of where it came from, and the connection to Jennings' penny-operated retiring rooms is widely and plausibly repeated as its source, though it is worth being honest, in the same spirit of careful specificity this channel tries to bring to every claim it makes, that the phrase's exact path from George Jennings' turnstile to everyday conversation is not as cleanly documented in surviving print as the tidiness of the story might suggest. What can be said with real confidence is that Jennings' retiring rooms were genuinely the first facility of their kind most working Londoners had ever used, that the penny fee for the privilege was widely reported and widely remarked upon at the time. and that whatever its precise linguistic lineage, the coincidence between the fee and the phrase has proven remarkably durable in popular memory for a reason. None of this abstract history was on Eliza's mind by early afternoon, because what she actually needed, with an urgency her pregnancy had made considerably more pressing than it would otherwise have been, was simply to reach one of the retiring rooms before her own discomfort became honestly difficult to manage in public. Victorian female dress, with its multiple layers of petticoat, corsetry, and structured skirt, made the basic physical logistics of using any sanitary facility considerably more time-consuming than it would have been for a man. A fact that mattered rather more than usual to a woman managing an unsettled stomach and an early pregnancy she had told no one outside her own household about. The retiring rooms nearest the machinery court, the ones Eliza and Thomas eventually located after a search that cost them a plainly frustrating quarter of an hour, were doing a brisk and entirely predictable trade by that point in the day. A queue of perhaps a dozen women stretching back from the entrance, patient in the specific, tight-lipped way of people managing a private discomfort in a very public setting. Eliza joined it without complaint, because complaint was not, in any real sense, an available option, and passed the wait making quiet conversation with a stranger a little further along in the same queue. A woman about her own age who had travelled, she mentioned, all the way from Kentish Town, with her sister, and who confided in the particular hushed register women of the period reserved for exactly this kind of subject, that she had never in her life used a proper water closet before, let alone one with its own towel and comb provided. The queue itself, and the sheer administrative effort of maintaining clean, functioning, properly stocked facilities against a demand running into the hundreds of thousands over the course of a single summer, points to something the popular retelling of Jennings' penny closets tends to flatten out of the story, which is exactly how much strain a properly novel piece of infrastructure came under the moment it was actually exposed to the full scale of Victorian public appetite for it. Attendants staffed the rooms in continuous shifts, replenishing towels, maintaining the plumbing, and managing the queue itself with a briskness that surviving accounts describe as generally courteous but necessarily businesslike. The sheer volume of visitors leaving little room for anything more leisurely. On the exhibition's busiest days, with attendance running into the tens of thousands, the queue outside a popular retiring room could stretch long enough that visitors calculated their own timing around it with real deliberation, judging, much as Eliza and Thomas had judged their refreshment budget, exactly how much of their limited day they were willing to spend standing in a second queue quite this soon after surviving the first one at the gate. There is a particular and rather pointed irony worth naming here. One that connects directly back to everything already said about the crush at the entrance and the heat under the glass roof. A great deal of anxious planning had gone into managing the crowd's behaviour, into extra constables and careful gate arrangements, and a general institutional worry about what admitting the labouring poor to a building full of valuable exhibits might produce. Considerably less anticipatory thought, relatively speaking, had gone into planning for the perfectly predictable, perfectly universal fact that tens of thousands of human bodies drinking Schweppes lemonade in July heat across the length of a full day were going to generate a correspondingly enormous and entirely ordinary demand for sanitary facilities. Jennings' retiring rooms represented a genuine and forward-thinking solution to that demand, considerably more thoughtful than the ventilation system or the refreshment pricing had proven to be, and they were, even so, tested to their absolute limit by a public need that had never before been measured or planned for at anything approaching this scale. For Eliza specifically, reaching the front of the queue and finally making use of the clean, water-flushed closet Jennings' attendants maintained brought a genuine and immediate physical relief that had very little to do with novelty and a great deal to do with simple, exhausted gratitude. She washed her hands afterward at a basin provided for exactly that purpose, an ordinary courtesy that nonetheless struck her, she would later admit to her own mother, as a small luxury she had not expected to encounter inside a building she had come to see for its diamonds and its machinery rather than its plumbing. Thomas, waiting outside with Anne on his hip, used the men's facilities in their own turn a short while later, and the family rejoined the main flow of the exhibition, somewhat lighter, somewhat calmer, and, in Eliza's case particularly, considerably more able to focus her remaining attention on the wonders she had actually come to see rather than on the increasingly urgent private discomfort that had been quietly competing with them for her attention since shortly after midday. The broader context worth carrying forward from this chapter concerns exactly how much genuine credit George Jennings deserves for recognizing a need the exhibition's other planners had left largely unaddressed, and exactly how far that single, well-designed solution still fell short of the full scale of demand it was suddenly asked to meet. 827,000 paying visitors across 6 months represents, on its own terms, one of the more quietly successful pieces of infrastructure the exhibition produced. A genuine improvement in ordinary Londoners' expectations of what public sanitation could and should look like. Expectations that would go on to shape the design of public conveniences across Britain for decades afterward. It also represents, calculated across the exhibition's roughly 140 operating days, an average approaching 6,000 individual uses of Jennings' facilities on an ordinary day. A volume that the queue Eliza stood in, that July afternoon suggests, was managed with real competence and real strain in more or less equal measure. The retiring rooms were, in their own modest and unglamorous way, exactly as impressive an achievement as the crystal fountain or the diamond in its cage. They were simply an achievement almost nobody thought to memorialize in an engraving afterward, precisely because the need they answered was the one category of physical demand polite Victorian conversation had the least available vocabulary for discussing openly, then or, in truth, for some considerable time afterward. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what the air itself would actually have carried by 2 o'clock on a July afternoon, because smell, more than any single fact already covered, is the sense that would have told a visitor most clearly how far this particular hour had drifted from the picture on the admission handbill. If you imagine the atmosphere inside a grand exhibition hall filled with silk, flowers, and fresh paint, you probably imagine something reasonably pleasant, perhaps a little heavy with varnish, nothing especially alarming. The actual air drifting through the transept by mid-afternoon that July was a good deal more complicated than that. A shifting layered mixture that told a story about the crowd itself rather than about the exhibits they had come to see. Nearest the refreshment courts, the dominant note was sugar, spilled ginger beer, and warm bread. Nearer the machinery court, hot oil and coal smoke drifting in from the great steam engines running continuously for the benefit of admiring crowds. And running underneath both of those, present everywhere in the building regardless of which gallery a visitor happened to be standing in, was the steadily accumulating smell of a very large number of human bodies dressed in wool, standing close together, in heat, across the length of an entire day, a smell every visitor present was simultaneously producing and enduring, since respectable society, whatever its elaborate rules about outward presentation, had comparatively few reliable tools for managing body odor across a hot summer afternoon spent almost entirely without access to washing facilities beyond Jennings' penny closets. For Eliza specifically, that particular smell had become by early afternoon a good deal more than simply unpleasant. Heightened sensitivity to smell is a common and well-documented feature of early pregnancy, one Eliza had already noticed for herself over the preceding weeks without having any settled vocabulary to describe it, and the effect inside a hot, densely packed building proved considerably more intense than anything she had experienced walking the ordinary streets of Bethnal Green. Odours that Thomas barely registered, warm wool, spilled Schweppes lemonade turning faintly sticky on the floor, the mingled sweat of several thousand nearby strangers, arrived for Eliza with an unwelcome vividness that made her stomach's already precarious morning considerably harder to manage through the middle hours of the afternoon. She found herself more than once pressing a handkerchief lightly scented with lavender water against her nose and mouth as she passed through the more crowded sections of the gallery. a small habit she shared with a great many other women around her that day, though for entirely different reasons than most of them realized they had in common with her. What most of those women believed, doctors and laypeople alike, was that disease itself traveled primarily through the air, carried in a form of contamination popularly called miasma, an invisible vapor rising from decaying organic matter, standing water, and any other source of foul odor. Under this theory, a bad smell was not simply unpleasant. It was a genuine warning sign, direct sensory evidence that dangerous, disease-bearing air was actively present and actively threatening anyone unfortunate enough to breathe it. This was not old-fashioned superstition to a Londoner standing inside the Crystal Palace in the summer of 1851. It was current, urgent medical orthodoxy, and it had been proven, in the minds of most ordinary people, only 2 summers earlier in the most direct and terrible way imaginable. The cholera epidemic of 1848 and 1849 had swept through London and killed well over 14,000 people in the capital alone, part of a national outbreak that would eventually claim something in the region of 50,000 lives across Britain. And the association between filthy, foul-smelling neighbourhoods and mass death had settled itself into the ordinary Victorian imagination with a force no amount of careful science was likely to dislodge quickly. That same epidemic had already produced the physician most likely to have been right about what actually caused it, though almost nobody standing inside the Crystal Palace that July had any reason to know his name yet. John Snow, a London doctor with a long-standing interest in the mechanics of disease transmission, had published a paper in 1849 in the direct aftermath of the epidemic, arguing that cholera spread not through the air at all, but through contaminated water, an idea that ran directly against the miasma orthodoxy nearly every physician of standing in England still held. Snow's theory remained, in the summer of 1851, a minority position within the medical profession, interesting to a handful of specialists and entirely unknown to the ordinary visitors filing past the crystal fountain with scented handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. It would take a second, even more devastating outbreak 3 years later, traced by Snow directly to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street in Soho, to begin shifting genuine medical and official opinion toward the theory he had already, quietly and correctly, put into print in 1849. In the summer of 1851, that vindication still lay entirely in the future, and every visitor inside the building that afternoon was applying, in good faith, the best medical understanding actually available to them, which happened, in this one specific and rather important respect, to be wrong. Eliza's own particular fear that afternoon had less to do with any specific memory of the 1849 epidemic, which she had lived through as a girl of barely 11 and remembered mostly through her mother's hushed, careful references to a neighbouring family who had lost 2 children within the same week, and rather more to do with a general, inherited caution about crowded, poorly ventilated spaces that had been quietly instilled in nearly every Londoner of her generation. She held her breath instinctively, much as thousands of other visitors did that same afternoon. Whenever the crowd around her thickened past a certain density, a habit so automatic she likely could not have explained exactly when or why she had first developed it. She was not being foolish by the standards of her own era. She was behaving exactly as any reasonably careful young mother would have behaved, applying the best available public health knowledge of her day to protect herself and the child she was carrying from a threat she had every reason to believe was real and immediate. The broader context here says something important about how Victorian society experienced the relationship between its own senses and its own safety. Miasma theory was not simply bad science accepted through ignorance. It was, on its own terms, a reasonably coherent framework built on genuine observed correlation, since areas with poor sanitation, standing water, and pervasive foul odor did correlate strongly with higher disease rates, for reasons the theory correctly identified even while misunderstanding the actual mechanism at work. The historian Judith Flanders has written about how deeply this belief shaped everyday Victorian behaviour, From the design of hospital wards to the routine domestic practice of airing rooms and burning scented substances against suspected contamination. An entire society organizing its instinctive sense of danger around the wrong sensory cue, with consequences that would not be properly corrected until germ theory gained real acceptance decades later. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Eliza and every other visitor holding a scented handkerchief to their face that July afternoon were feeling, in their own bodies, a perfectly rational, evidence-based fear of exactly the wrong threat, while a physician who had already worked out something closer to the truth sat largely ignored. His 1849 paper gathering dust on the shelves of the small number of colleagues who had bothered to read it at all. The wonder of the Crystal Palace did not depend, in any sense, on the accuracy of the science its visitors carried inside their own heads. It simply proceeded alongside that science, imperfect and sincerely held in more or less equal measure. The same way it proceeded alongside a crush at the gate, a queue for the retiring rooms, and a corset already working its slow, quiet damage against Eliza's ribs. She pressed her lavender handkerchief to her face, breathed as shallowly as she reasonably could through the thickest part of the machinery court, and did not think, even for a moment, that she was doing anything other than exactly the sensible thing a careful mother ought to do. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that comes from being truly lost inside a space too large to hold in the mind all at once, and Thomas discovered it for himself in the middle of the afternoon, standing at a junction of galleries with Anne's hand in his, and no very clear idea, for the first time all day, of which direction actually led back toward the machinery court he had promised his daughter they would revisit before going home. If you imagine finding your way around a Victorian exhibition hall, you probably picture something reasonably straightforward. A single long building with a few obvious landmarks, easy enough to navigate by simple instinct. The Crystal Palace defeated that instinct almost immediately for a great many of its visitors. A building more than a third of a mile in length, arranged into courts and avenues representing dozens of participating nations. Its layout logical enough on the printed guidebook a wealthier visitor might have purchased at the door, and considerably less legible to a family like the Marshes, who had not budgeted for a guidebook and were navigating instead by memory, by the position of the sun through the glass roof, and by an increasingly uncertain sense of which direction they had actually come from. The organizers themselves seemed to have anticipated some version of this problem, since attendants were stationed at intervals through the building specifically to offer directions and to help reunite visitors separated from their own party. A service that saw, by every account, near constant use across the length of an ordinary shilling day. It was in exactly this kind of momentary confusion, paused at a junction of galleries trying to get his bearings, that Thomas felt a hand brushed too deliberately against the outer pocket of his coat, light enough that a less watchful man might not have noticed it at all, and turned in time to see a young man in a respectable enough coat of his own already moving off into the crowd with the particular, unhurried, unremarkable gait of someone who had done this exact thing a great many times before. Nothing was taken. Thomas's own instinctive movement, a hand clapped flat against his pocket the instant he felt the touch, had been enough to end the attempt before it properly began, and he said nothing to Eliza about it beyond a brief, tightened grip on Anne's hand and a muttered suggestion that they move on toward a less crowded gallery. The broader reality behind that brief, unremarked moment says a good deal about how Victorian London actually understood the relationship between crowds, wealth, and crime. Pickpocketing was not a marginal concern in the London of 1851. It was a well-organized, extensively documented criminal trade, catalogued in exhaustive and often startling detail that same year by the journalist and social investigator Henry Mayhew, whose survey of London's labouring and criminal poor, published in instalments through exactly this period, described entire specialised categories of thief working the city's crowded public spaces. From children trained from a young age to work a packed omnibus to more accomplished operators who specialised in exactly the kind of momentarily distracted, disoriented visitor Thomas had briefly become at that gallery junction. A building filled with tens of thousands of strangers, each carrying their admission shilling and whatever additional coin they had budgeted for lemonade and buns, many of them visiting London for the first time in their lives and correspondingly unfamiliar with its particular hazards, represented to the city's professional criminal class an opportunity considerably too obvious to ignore. The exhibition's own organisers understood this risk clearly enough to prepare for it with real seriousness, which is part of why the additional 1,000 constables discussed earlier had been requested in the first place, officers deployed not merely to manage the crush at the gates, but to patrol the galleries themselves, watching for exactly the kind of practiced, unhurried theft Thomas had narrowly avoided. Newspaper coverage through the exhibition's run occasionally reported successful prosecutions of pickpockets caught working the crowd, though the more striking finding, repeated across contemporary accounts and later scholarly assessments alike, is how comparatively low the actual rate of theft and disorder turned out to be once the exhibition was fully underway. A deeply reassuring outcome given the almost feverish anxiety that had preceded the opening of the shilling days in the weeks beforehand. Respectable opinion in the spring of 1851 had worried aloud, in print and in private correspondence, that admitting the labouring poor to a building filled with valuable goods at an affordable price would produce something considerably closer to organised plunder than the orderly, if occasionally light-fingered, crowd that actually materialised. For visitors from outside London specifically, a category that included an enormous share of the exhibition's total attendance across its 6-month run, the particular hazard extended well beyond pickpocketing into a more general vulnerability to swindlers and confidence men working the crowds around the park's approaches, individuals offering, for a small fee, guidance to the best exhibits, help securing a supposedly scarce admission ticket, or lodging arrangements that turned out, on arrival, to be rather less accommodating than promised. Excursion trains had begun bringing visitors into London from across the country specifically to see the exhibition, many of them making their very first visit to the capital for exactly this purpose, arriving with money set aside for the journey and the admission fee and considerably less first-hand knowledge of exactly how a determined London swindler operated than a lifelong resident like Thomas possessed. Eliza and Thomas, both born and raised within the city itself, carried an instinctive wariness that a great many of their fellow visitors that July simply did not have the opportunity to develop. A quiet advantage neither of them thought of in quite those terms, but that had, in its own small way, already spared their family a loss that afternoon's momentary confusion at the gallery junction could very easily have produced. There is something worth naming plainly in the specific shape of the anxiety London's respectable classes had carried into the summer of 1851, an anxiety focused overwhelmingly on the imagined danger of the crowd itself, on what several 100,000 working visitors gathered in one place, at an affordable price, might collectively choose to do. The Duke of Wellington himself, still serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Army at the age of 81, is widely reported to have kept a substantial reserve of troops available at short notice for the duration of the exhibition, a precaution against disorder that, in the event, went almost entirely unused. What that same anxious preparation had rather less thoroughly anticipated was the considerably more mundane and more individually targeted danger of a single skilled pickpocket working a single momentarily distracted visitor in a single crowded gallery. A danger that had nothing to do with crowds as a collective political force and everything to do with the ordinary, opportunistic criminal economy that had always operated in London's busiest public spaces, and that a building filled with 6 million visitors across 6 months was always, inevitably, going to attract in some quantity. Thomas said little more about the incident for the rest of the afternoon, though he kept Anne rather closer to his side for the remainder of their time inside the building, and found himself, without quite meaning to, cataloguing the crowd around them with a fraction more of his attention than he had been giving it before, watching hands rather than faces in the particular practiced way of a Londoner who understood, without ever having to articulate it, exactly what kind of ordinary, unglamorous risk a day like this one actually carried alongside its wonder. Eliza, unaware of exactly how close her husband's pocket had come to being emptied a few minutes earlier, continued to marvel at the building around her with the same open, unguarded pleasure she had carried since the crystal fountain first came into view that morning. A small and rather telling illustration of how selectively the day's genuine hazards actually announced themselves to the people experiencing them. Some felt immediately and directly in an overheated body, others passing close enough to touch a family's fortunes and then moving on entirely unnoticed by anyone but the one person quick enough to feel the hand before it found its mark. There is one further category of hazard worth walking through carefully, because it is the one Thomas, of everyone in his small family, was actually equipped to recognize, and it had nothing to do with pickpockets or foul air at all. It concerned the goods themselves, the very objects 6 million visitors had come specifically to admire. If you imagine the exhibits at a great Victorian industrial fair, you probably picture something essentially safe to stand near. Glass cases, roped enclosures, an appropriate and reassuring distance maintained between visitor and object. A meaningful share of what filled the Crystal Palace that summer offered nothing of the kind. The exhibition's machinery court, one of its most popular sections and the one Anne had been begging to revisit all afternoon, consisted almost entirely of working industrial equipment, power looms, printing presses, a hydraulic press, and a variety of steam-driven engines, all of it running in continuous operation for the direct benefit of the crowds gathered to watch. Belts turning, gears meshing, in several cases with barely more than a low rail separating the machinery from the visitors pressed close against it for a better view. One printing press ran throughout the exhibition, producing copies of an illustrated newspaper on the spot, its rollers and type cylinders turning in full view of a crowd standing near enough on the busiest days to have touched it without much difficulty at all. Thomas, whose own working life in the cabinet-making trade involved daily proximity to blades, saws, and the various mechanized tools that had begun creeping into even a fairly traditional furniture workshop by 1851, watched the machinery court with an attention considerably more practical than aesthetic. He noticed, in a way most visitors around him plainly did not, exactly how close the exposed drive belts ran to the crowd's own shoulders and sleeves, exactly how little stood between an inattentive child's curious fingers and a set of turning gears, exactly how casually the attendants operating the equipment moved around machinery that, in his own workshop, every experienced hand treated with considerably more wary respect. He kept Anne's hand held rather firmly through this particular gallery, a precaution she found mildly tiresome given how badly she wanted a closer look at the printing press, and explained to her, in the simplified terms a 4-year-old could follow, that machines like this one could hurt a person who got too close to the moving parts. A lesson drawn directly and without much translation from his own daily working life, rather than from anything the exhibition's own. Posted notices troubled to mention. The broader industrial context here matters considerably, because the machinery court's casual proximity between visitor and moving equipment reflected, in miniature, the general state of workplace safety across British industry in 1851, a state that remained, by any modern standard, alarmingly underdeveloped. The Factory Acts already in force by this date, the product of decades of hard-fought reform campaigning, had begun placing real limits on the hours and conditions under which children and young persons could be employed in textile mills specifically, a genuine achievement won against considerable resistance from mill owners. Those same acts said essentially nothing about guarding the moving parts of machinery itself, and industrial accidents involving crushed or severed limbs remained a routine, largely unregulated hazard of factory work throughout this period. Reported often enough in local newspapers that readers of Thomas's own class had grown accustomed to treating them as an ordinary, if regrettable, feature of an industrial economy rather than a preventable failure demanding urgent correction. A machinery court built to showcase exactly this kind of equipment to an admiring public, staffed by operators drawn from the same industrial workforce that lived with these risks daily, was never likely to apply a meaningfully higher safety standard than the factories that equipment had actually come from. A second, quieter hazard ran through the exhibition's textile and decorative displays rather than its machinery. One considerably less visible to a visitor's own eyes than a turning gear, but no less real for being invisible. Many of the vivid green dyes used across Victorian Britain in this period, in fabric, in wallpaper, in artificial flowers, and in a wide range of other decorative goods exactly like the ones displayed in the exhibition's various national courts, derived their striking colour from copper arsenite compounds, commonly known by trade names like Shields green and emerald green. These pigments had been in wide commercial use for decades. By 1851, prized for a brilliance no other available green dye could match, and handled throughout their manufacture and application with essentially no protective measure, since the specific toxicity of arsenic compounds absorbed gradually through repeated skin contact, or released as fine dust during manufacture and finishing, remained only partially understood even by the physicians and chemists of the period who had begun raising early concerns about it. A visitor admiring a length of vividly coloured green silk or a display of artificial flowers in one of the exhibition's textile courts had no meaningful way of knowing, and in most cases no particular reason to wonder, whether the brilliant colour in front of them carried exactly this kind of quiet chemical cost, buried in the manufacturing process long before the finished goods ever reached her. Display case in Hyde Park. None of this registered as an immediate, felt danger to anyone standing in front of those particular displays that July afternoon, in the way the machinery court's exposed gears registered instantly and viscerally to Thomas's trained eye. It belonged instead to the same broader pattern already visible in the paint trapped beneath every surface visitors touched and the plumbing straining under every queue outside Jennings' retiring rooms. A 19th century industrial economy capable of producing objects of real beauty and real engineering sophistication while remaining only partially, unevenly aware of exactly what those same processes of production were quietly doing to the bodies of the people who made them and, in the case of the arsenic dyes specifically, to the bodies of the people who would go on to wear, decorate their homes with, or simply stand near them for years afterward. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the very court Anne had been most excited to revisit, the one filled with turning gears and thundering presses that had captured her 4-year-old imagination more thoroughly than any painting or sculpture in the building, was also the single most literally dangerous space in the entire exhibition, and that neither she nor the overwhelming majority of visitors moving through it that afternoon had any particular reason to sense the risk at all. Thomas's own trained caution, drawn from years spent working wood and blade together in a Shoreditch workshop, gave his family a small and largely invisible advantage that afternoon. A working man's hard-won education, standing in, imperfect as it was, for the safety regulation the machinery court itself did not yet reliably provide. Now, the shilling itself, because the coin in Thomas's pocket that morning represented something considerably larger than the price of admission. It represented an argument conducted in the weeks before the exhibition opened its doors to visitors like the Marshes at all about exactly how much of English society deserved to be let inside that argument's outcome. If you imagine the debate over admitting working people to the Great Exhibition, you probably assume it was settled quickly and generously, a straightforward decision to make a national triumph available to the whole nation rather than restricting it to the wealthy. The actual debate, conducted in newspaper columns, private correspondence, and no small amount of anxious drawing-room conversation through the spring of 1851, was considerably more fraught than that assumption suggests. Season ticket holders and visitors willing to pay the initial 5-shilling admission had enjoyed the building largely to themselves for the exhibition's first several weeks, a period respectable opinion had found reassuring precisely because it kept the crowds small, well-dressed, and, in the anxious language of the period, sufficiently select. The proposal to introduce a shilling admission price on 4 days out of every week, opening the building to something much closer to the full breadth of London's working population, provoked genuine alarm among a segment of the aristocracy and the propertied middle class, who worried, in terms recorded plainly enough in the letters and newspaper editorials of the period, that a building filled with valuable and delicate objects, thrown open to the labouring poor at a price nearly anyone in steady employment could afford, was inviting theft, vandalism, and quite possibly organised disorder on a scale London had rarely seen inside a single enclosed space. Those fears did not survive contact with the actual Shilling Day crowds. From the 26th of May onward, when the reduced admission price first took effect, the working visitors who filed through the turnstiles in their tens of thousands proved, week after week, to be exactly what the exhibition's more optimistic organisers had hoped and its more anxious critics had doubted: curious, careful, and by every surviving account remarkably restrained in their handling of the goods on display. Complaints about damage or theft attributable specifically to Shilling Day visitors turn out, on close examination, to be strikingly rare given the sheer volume of people involved, and the pattern held steadily enough across the full length of the exhibition's run that the Shilling Days quickly went from a source of anxious private worry to one of the organisers' proudest public claims. Offered as direct evidence that ordinary working people, given the chance and the price of admission, were entirely capable of appreciating a national spectacle with exactly the same care and seriousness a wealthier visitor might bring to it. Eliza and Thomas had no particular awareness, standing inside the building that July afternoon, that their own quiet, careful conduct, pausing to admire rather than touch, keeping Anne's curious hands close, moving through the crowded galleries with the same unhurried respect they might have brought to a church, formed part of a pattern being watched and recorded, in aggregate, by observers considerably more anxious about the outcome than either of them had any reason to suspect. They were simply behaving, that afternoon, the way they had been raised to behave in any public space where good conduct mattered. A private habit of respectability that happened, multiplied across several million similar working visitors over 6 months, to settle one of the more contentious social arguments of the entire mid-Victorian period rather more decisively than any amount of parliamentary debate could have managed on its own. Queen Victoria herself provided a rather different kind of evidence for exactly how seriously the exhibition's organisers took the question of who deserved access to this particular spectacle, and under what conditions. The Queen visited the Crystal Palace more than 40 separate times across the exhibition's 6-month run. A level of personal engagement that went well beyond ordinary royal patronage and reflected, by her own diary's frequent and evidently sincere testimony, genuine delight in the building and its contents. Each of those visits required its own careful choreography, galleries cleared or partially cleared ahead of her arrival, security arrangements coordinated between the palace household and the exhibition's own management, crowds managed with a level of advanced planning considerably more thorough than anything extended to an ordinary Shilling Day visitor arriving at the Eastern Gate. The contrast is not, in itself, a scandal or a hidden injustice. A reigning monarch's movements have always required exactly this kind of careful management, in 1851 as in any other period. It does, however, illustrate rather plainly the two entirely different registers of consideration the exhibition was capable of extending to its visitors, one calibrated with meticulous, anticipatory care around a single royal person, the other calibrated, for the crowd Eliza and Thomas belonged to, around whatever modest sanitary and safety provision the commissioners had judged sufficient for several tens of thousands of ordinary bodies arriving at once. There is a further piece of this particular July day worth naming plainly before the family's own afternoon draws toward its close. One that has nothing to do with the building itself, and everything to do with the world, just a short walk beyond its glass walls. Eliza's own father, working his handloom in a Bethnal Green garret that same July afternoon, rather than joining his daughter's family inside the exhibition, belonged to a trade the exhibition itself had, in its own quiet way, helped push a little further toward its own extinction. Spitalfields silk weaving had been in slow, grinding decline for decades by 1851, undercut by cheaper machine-woven imports and by continental competition operating under trade terms increasingly favorable to foreign manufacture. And the Great Exhibition's own celebration of industrial machinery, the power looms running continuously in the machinery court that had so delighted Anne that afternoon, represented to a hand-loom weaver like Eliza's father not a triumph to admire, but a fairly direct preview of the economic forces steadily eroding his own livelihood. He had encouraged Eliza to attend with her own family regardless, told her plainly that a day of wonder was not something to deny herself on his account, and had said rather less about his own view of what exactly all that gleaming machinery actually represented for a man in his particular trade and his particular corner of London. The broader context worth carrying forward here concerns the specific and rather carefully constructed image of national unity the Great Exhibition had been designed, from its earliest planning, to project. Prince Albert's own stated ambitions for the event emphasized precisely this vision. A demonstration that British industry and British ingenuity had produced not division but shared national prosperity. A single glorious achievement in which every class of English society could take equal and genuine pride. The shilling days, and the restrained, respectful conduct of the working visitors who filled them, did real and important work in support of exactly that vision, and the pride Eliza and Thomas both truly felt walking through the transept that afternoon was not, in any sense, a manufactured or dishonest emotion. It coexisted, though, with a rather less unified reality only a few miles away in Bethnal Green and Spitalfields, where an entire trade was quietly dying, where housing remained cramped and often seriously unhealthy, and where the same industrial machinery being celebrated inside the Crystal Palace as evidence of national triumph was, for a meaningful number of the families living closest to its glass walls, part of the reason their own circumstances were growing steadily more precarious rather than less. The historian Geoffrey Auerbach has written directly about this tension, arguing that the exhibition's carefully cultivated image of classless national celebration obscured, rather than resolved, the real and growing economic divisions running through mid-Victorian Britain, divisions the shilling day crowd's good behaviour made far easier to overlook than to actually address. None of this diminishes what the shilling days actually achieved. A real and consequential expansion of who got to participate directly in one of the great public spectacles of the century, tested against the era's own considerable anxiety and settled, decisively, in favour of the crowd's own dignity and self-restraint. It simply means that the unity on display inside the Crystal Palace that July afternoon was, like so much else about the day, considerably more carefully constructed and considerably more selectively true than the building's dazzling surface ever let on to the visitors admiring it. Eliza thought of her father only briefly that afternoon, standing for a moment before a display of French silk woven on a mechanized loom, noting privately, without saying anything to Thomas, that the pattern was handsome enough but lacked, to her own trained eye, a certain particular fineness her father's slower, more painstaking handwork still reliably produced. She did not linger on the thought. There was, after all, a great deal more of the exhibition still to see, and a growing bodily awareness felt now quite distinctly in her lower back and her aching feet, that the family's remaining time inside the building was considerably shorter than the wonder still on display around them. By early evening, with the worst heat of the day finally beginning to ease and the light through the glass roof turning from the hard white of noon towards something softer and more golden, the crowd inside the building began, gradually and without any single visible signal, to thin toward the exits, and the walk home told its own quiet, final account of exactly what the day had actually cost the three bodies making it. Anne fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder within a few hundred yards of leaving the park. A heavy, boneless sleep that only a thoroughly overstimulated 4-year-old achieves. One small shoe half worked loose on her foot and never quite recovered from wherever it had slipped during the afternoon's crush near the machinery court. Eliza walked beside her husband, with her bonnet ribbon slightly wilted, her corset loosened a fraction more than strict propriety would have approved of had anyone been paying close enough attention to notice, and a tiredness settled through her whole body that had nothing to do with any single hour of the day and everything to do with the accumulated weight of all of them together. The crush at the gate, the queue for Jennings' retiring rooms, the heat trapped under 900,000 square feet of glass, the careful rationing of a small refreshment budget, the private, unspoken vigilance of a woman managing an early pregnancy through a day that had asked rather more of her body than she had fully anticipated when she pinned that ribbon into place before dawn. She did not regret a single hour of it. Asked in the weeks that followed to describe her day at the exhibition to her own mother, to the women she sewed alongside at the draper's shop, to her father bent over his loom in the garret room upstairs, Eliza would tell the story the way a great many working Londoners told theirs that summer, as wonder, nearly undiluted. The crystal fountain, the diamond in its cage, the sheer scale of a room built almost entirely from light, with barely a mention of the corset's slow damage to her ribs or the fear that had gripped her, however briefly, in the crush near the barrier, or the several increasingly urgent minutes spent searching for a retiring room before her own body's insistence became properly difficult to manage gracefully. This was not concealment exactly, and it was certainly not dishonesty. It was simply the shape a good day out was supposed to take when told back to someone who had not been there. Adventure, rather than ordeal. Because Victorian conversational convention, much like the corset itself, had never really provided comfortable room for the two to be spoken about honestly in the same breath. Thomas carried his own quieter reckoning home that evening. A working man's sober tally of exactly what the day had actually demanded of his family's small resources, the admission tickets, the lemonade, the omnibus fare they had ultimately spent, rather than face the walk home with an exhausted child and a wife who could no longer entirely hide how tired she had become. It amounted, by his own careful arithmetic, to considerably more than a single shilling apiece, once every incidental cost was properly counted, a genuine and meaningfully felt expense against a household budget that would run a little leaner than usual for the following fortnight in consequence. He did not resent the expense. He had wanted, as much as Eliza had, to give Anne a day she would remember, and by every visible measure the day had delivered exactly that. But he walked home turning over the specific, unglamorous mathematics of pleasure purchased on a working family's income, a calculation the exhibition's own celebratory newspaper coverage, filled with breathless descriptions of the crowd's evident delight, had never once thought to include alongside it. The broader context worth naming plainly here, standing now near the close of a single long day, concerns exactly how selectively the historical record of the Great Exhibition has generally chosen to remember it. The engravings and the newspaper accounts written up afterward by correspondents who had, in a great many cases, visited on the costlier days when the crowd ran thinner and considerably more comfortable, or who had simply chosen, in the retelling, to emphasize wonder over ordeal in exactly the way Eliza herself instinctively did, produced a version of the exhibition that survives far more vividly in popular memory than the version Eliza's own aching ribs and Thomas's careful household arithmetic would have offered in its place. Both versions are true. Neither cancels the other out. The wonder was entirely real, and so, running quietly alongside it through every hour of the same afternoon, was the heat, the crush, the queue, the fear near the gate, the pickpocket's hand that never quite closed on Thomas's pocket, and the careful, ongoing calculation of exactly how much a single day's pleasure was actually going to cost a family that had saved for weeks simply to be standing inside that building at all. Step back now, far enough to see the whole of this day at once, the way you might step back from a large painting to let its individual brushstrokes resolve into a single coherent image, and a handful of patterns emerge that run quietly underneath every chapter of Eliza and Thomas's afternoon, connecting the crush at the gate to the queue outside Jennings' retiring rooms, the lavender handkerchief to the exposed gears in the machinery court, in ways that a visitor standing at any single point along that day would have had little particular reason to notice. The first pattern is the simplest to state and, in its own way, the hardest to fully absorb. Victorian engineering confidence, that summer, ran well ahead of Victorian capacity to manage the ordinary bodies gathered to admire it. The same nation capable of raising 19 acres of iron and glass in under 6 months, capable of assembling machinery from every corner of the industrialized world under a single continuous roof and running it in front of admiring crowds without incident, proved considerably less capable of the more mundane task of keeping several tens of thousands of visitors adequately cool, adequately hydrated, and safely spaced along a footpath. This was not hypocrisy, and it would be a mistake to read it as simple carelessness either. It reflects something more structural about the era, an engineering imagination that reliably outpaced its own instinct for the unglamorous, unphotographed labor of caring for the ordinary bodies its achievements were ultimately built to serve. Joseph Paxton solved the problem of covering 19 acres in glass with real brilliance. He solved the problem of what that glass would do to a crowd in July heat rather less completely, and the 40 thermometers the sappers and miners checked twice an hour, all summer long, quietly recorded the gap between those two achievements without anyone at the time framing it in quite those terms. The second pattern concerns labor and its erasure, and it connects the family's own afternoon directly to the people who made the day's wonder possible in the first place. George Jennings' retiring rooms functioned as smoothly as they did across hundreds of thousands of individual visits because a workforce of attendants whose names appear nowhere in the exhibition's celebratory literature kept them clean, kept them stocked, and kept the queue moving with a briskness Eliza herself benefited from without ever once thinking to wonder who exactly was making it possible. The royal sappers and miners spent an entire summer climbing ladders and adjusting louvre boards so that the building's heat, however imperfectly, stayed within some tolerable range. The power looms turning so impressively in the machinery court represented, to a handloom weaver like Eliza's own father, not simply an engineering marvel, but the specific, named mechanism steadily displacing his own livelihood, a fact the exhibition's celebratory framing had no particular interest in dwelling on. Wonder at the Great Exhibition was produced by a great deal of careful, largely uncredited labor performed by people who mostly did not get to walk through the finished building themselves as paying visitors and consumed that July afternoon. By a family who had saved for weeks for the privilege and who understood, in their own bodies rather than in any abstract sense, exactly how much a single shilling's worth of wonder actually demanded of the people producing it. The third pattern is a matter of perception rather than money, and it may be the strangest of the four to sit with from this distance. An entire building full of reasonably careful, reasonably intelligent Victorians spent their day anxiously guarding against precisely the wrong dangers. They pressed lavender handkerchiefs to their faces and held their breath near the densest parts of the crowd, applying, in good faith, the best medical understanding available to them, while the actual physician, who had already worked out something closer to the truth about how disease actually spread, sat almost entirely unread on the shelf of his own 1849 paper. The exhibition's organizers, meanwhile, poured enormous anxious energy into preparing for a crowd disturbance that never materialized. Extra constables, a substantial military reserve held quietly in readiness, while the more ordinary and more individually costly danger of a single pickpocket working a single distracted visitor received rather less organized attention by comparison. This is not an invitation to smug hindsight at the Victorians' expense. It is a reminder that every era, including our own, builds its sense of safety around whatever mechanisms its best available science and its prevailing social anxieties currently direct it toward, and that the gap between perceived danger and actual danger rarely announces itself clearly while it remains open. And the fourth pattern draws the other three together into something close to a single idea. The Great Exhibition was, at its core, an argument, delivered in iron, glass, and 6 million paid admissions, about what British industry, British engineering, and British national character could accomplish once properly united behind a single shared purpose. The shilling days, and the careful, restrained conduct of the working visitors who filled them, did real and important work in support of that argument, offering, week after week, genuine and moving evidence that curiosity and pride in national achievement crossed class lines considerably more readily than the exhibition's own anxious organizers had initially dared to hope. That evidence was, in its own way, entirely sincere, and Eliza and Thomas's own quiet pleasure walking through the transept that afternoon was no less real for being, in aggregate, part of the very pattern being observed and reported on. What the argument left far less room for was the reality running alongside it the entire time. A silk weaver's trade quietly dying a few streets from where his daughter stood admiring the machine that was helping to kill it. A young mother rationing her own thirst against a carefully fixed shilling budget. A pickpocket's hand testing a coat pocket in a crowd too vast for any number of constables to watch every corner of at once. The unity on display inside the Crystal Palace was genuine. It was also, like the building's own climate, considerably harder to sustain in practice than its most confident architects had originally believed. It is worth pausing, too, on how much deliberate work it takes to recover a day like this one at all, given how thoroughly the era's own preferred version of events has survived in place of it. Social historians including Judith Flanders and Liza Picard have built entire careers on precisely this kind of recovery. Working back from household account books, trade directories, medical case notes, and the occasional surviving diary to reconstruct what an ordinary body actually experienced underneath the more flattering record a period leaves behind of itself. Living history practitioners like Ruth Goodman have gone a step further, wearing the actual corsets and walking the actual miles in period footwear specifically to feel, in their own bodies, what a written account can only gesture toward. None of that work changes a single fact about the great exhibition's genuine achievement. It simply insists, patiently and against the pull of a much more comfortable popular memory, that the achievement and its cost belong together in the same account, rather than one quietly edited out to protect the other. A crystal fountain is easy enough to paint. A woman quietly counting her own breaths against the restriction of her own corset, 3 miles of dusty road already behind her, and several hours of standing still ahead, has never painted quite so easily, and that is exactly why the second image needs telling as deliberately and as patiently as the first one always has been. There is something worth naming plainly in the fact that none of these 4 patterns cancel out the wonder itself. Eliza's joy standing beneath the crystal fountain that morning was not a performance she was putting on for anyone's benefit, and it would be exactly as much a distortion of this story to treat her happiness as false consciousness as it would be to pretend the corset, the queue, and the careful shilling arithmetic never happened at all. Both things were true of the same body, in the same building, across the same July afternoon, the genuine delight and the genuine cost, running alongside each other the entire time, largely unremarked upon because Victorian public life offered so few comfortable ways to hold both truths up to the light at once and say plainly that a day could be wonderful and demanding in exactly equal measure. Return, now, to the threshold of the transept on that July morning, to the image this evening opened with sunlight pouring through 900,000 square feet of glass, the crystal fountain throwing its fine cool mist, a young woman standing perfectly still for one suspended minute, unable to speak for the simple size and brilliance of the room in front of her. Look at it again, now, with everything you have learned about what that particular morning actually contained. The young woman at the threshold is not merely admiring the architecture. She is standing in a corset that will, within a few hours, restrict her breathing badly enough to leave her faintly dizzy in the crush near the machinery court. In a wool dress chosen for durability rather than comfort, carrying a private early pregnancy she has not yet found the right moment to share even with her own mother. a pregnancy that will make the day's heat, its smells, and its long search for a clean retiring room considerably harder to bear than they would otherwise have been. She does not know yet that a pickpocket's hand will brush her husband's coat and fail to find its mark. She does not know that her own father, bent over his loom a few miles east, is watching the same industrial machinery she will admire that afternoons slowly erode the trade that has fed her family for 2 generations. She is also, by any honest account, having exactly the wonderful day she came to have, and there is no contradiction in that. Both things are true of her at once, in the same body, standing at the same threshold. The young man beside her is not merely another spectator either. He is a cabinet maker with a tradesman's eye that will, later that same afternoon, spot the danger in an exposed drive belt that several thousand other visitors will walk past without a second glance. He carries, without quite naming it to himself, a Londoner's practical wariness that will spare his family a theft most of the visitors around them that day would have had no comparable defense against. He has budgeted the day down to careful shillings and pence, weighing a second glass of lemonade against his daughter's evident thirst, and he will walk home that evening, turning over the exact arithmetic of what a single day's wonder actually cost a family in his position, a calculation no engraving of the opening ceremony would ever think to include. Around this family, and pressing gently against them from every direction along the crowded galleries, are several thousand other Victorians sharing some version of the very same day inside a body the admission handbill never once mentioned. Somewhere in that crowd, other mothers are pressing their own scented handkerchiefs to their faces, trusting a theory of disease that a London physician has already, quietly and correctly, begun to disprove in a paper almost nobody has troubled to read. Somewhere in the machinery court, other fathers are watching power looms turn with the same complicated mixture of admiration and private unease Thomas would have recognized instantly had he known to look for it in a stranger's face. Somewhere near a gallery junction, another pickpocket's hand is finding a pocket considerably less well guarded than Thomas Marsh's own, and somewhere near Jennings' retiring rooms, another queue is stretching back from the entrance, patient, largely silent, and considerably longer than the exhibition's own celebratory literature would ever think to depict. None of this diminishes what these 6 million visitors actually witnessed that summer, and it would be a mistake to walk away from this account treating the great exhibition as some kind of elaborate Victorian disaster dressed up as a triumph. It was not that. It was a genuine and remarkable achievement, the first time in history that ordinary working people, for the price of a single shilling, could stand under a roof built almost entirely of glass and see, gathered along one continuous span, the accumulated industrial and artistic output of the entire known world. Prince Albert's vision of a single unifying national spectacle, one capable of drawing genuine wonder from a silk weaver's daughter and a duchess in more or less equal measure, succeeded far more completely than its own anxious organizers had dared to expect in the spring before the shilling days began. What this account has tried to do, instead, is restore the missing half of that summer, the half that never made it into the celebratory engravings or the newspaper columns written by correspondents who mostly visited on the quieter, costlier days and left well before the worst of the afternoon crowding set in. The wonder was real. So was the heat trapped beneath 900,000 square feet of glass. Heat the royal sappers and miners measured twice an hour, all summer long, and never fully solved. So was the crush at the gate, and the queue for a clean water closet that 827,000 other visitors also stood in that same summer. So was the fear of bad air that pointed an entire population away from the actual mechanism of disease, sitting quietly ignored in a paper published 2 years earlier by a doctor named John Snow. So was the careful, unglamorous household arithmetic that made a single day's pleasure cost a family like the Marshes considerably more than the price of 1 shilling admission each. All of it happened in the same building, across the same few hours, to the same bodies, and none of it cancelled out the wonder. It simply completed the picture the postcards and the engravings left unfinished. Eliza and Thomas Marsh, as this account has said from its opening chapter, exist nowhere in the surviving parish registers of Bethnal Green or the wage books of any Shoreditch cabinet-making workshop. They are a composite, built from the well-documented, thoroughly researched experience of the working Londoners who made up the overwhelming majority of the Great Exhibition's Shilling Day visitors, drawn from the same social history scholarship that has spent decades carefully reconstructing exactly what ordinary Victorian bodies actually endured behind the era's more polished public record. The Great Exhibition itself, and everything that happened inside it that July, is entirely real. It closed on the 15th of October 1851, having drawn just over 6 million visitors through its doors across 141 operating days, a figure equivalent to roughly a third of the entire population of Britain at the time. The building itself did not stay in Hyde Park for very much longer. Dismantled the following year, it was rebuilt on a larger scale at Sydenham, 3 miles south of London, reopening there in 1854 for a further 8 decades of use before a catastrophic fire destroyed it entirely in the winter of 1936, a fire visible, by some accounts, from as far away as the English Channel. George Jennings went on, in the years following the exhibition, to become the leading sanitary engineer of his generation, and the standard he set with his penny operated retiring rooms at Hyde Park, shaped the design of public conveniences across Britain for the remainder of the century. A truly lasting achievement built on a foundation of 827,000 ordinary paying uses that summer alone. John Snow's waterborne theory of cholera transmission, so thoroughly ignored by the anxious crowd pressing lavender handkerchiefs to their faces beneath the Crystal Palace's glass roof, received its own dramatic and belated vindication just 3 years later, when a fresh outbreak in Soho gave Snow the opportunity to trace the source of a devastating local epidemic directly to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, work now remembered, correctly, as one of the founding achievements of modern epidemiology. Neither Jennings nor Snow was thinking, in the summer of 1851, about how their respective contributions would eventually be remembered. Jennings was managing a queue. Snow was watching a theory he knew to be correct go largely unread. Both of them, in their own quiet and unglamorous ways, were doing considerably more for the ordinary bodies filing past the Crystal Fountain that July than the fountain itself, for all its genuine beauty, was ever actually capable of doing. The exhibition's own finances left a further, more visible legacy behind it, one that still stands today a short distance from where the Crystal Palace originally rose in Hyde Park. The event closed with a substantial financial surplus, and the Royal Commission responsible for the exhibition used those profits to purchase a large tract of land in South Kensington, land that would eventually hold the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and the Royal Albert Hall, an entire cluster of national institutions still drawing visitors more than a century and a half later, funded in no small part by the accumulated shillings of visitors exactly like Eliza and Thomas Marsh. The irony carries its own quiet weight. A family who rationed their own thirst that July afternoon down to 2 careful glasses of lemonade had, in their own small way, helped underwrite museums that would spend the following century displaying, among a great many other things, the very sort of decorative arts and industrial machinery the exhibition itself had celebrated. This time behind glass cases considerably better ventilated than the building the objects had first been shown in. The exhibition's satirists had their own say in how the summer of 1851 would be remembered. Henry Mayhew, already deep into the research that would become his landmark survey of London's labouring poor, published a comic novel that same year following a fictional family's chaotic journey to see the exhibition, illustrated by George Cruikshank, with the kind of affectionate, exaggerated detail that turned the crush of excursion trains and country visitors into a running national joke, rather than a source of official embarrassment. That the crush itself was funny enough to sustain an entire comic novel says something worth remembering about how thoroughly the crowding, the confusion, and the general chaos of a shilling day had already become part of the exhibition's own accepted mythology well before the year was out. acknowledged openly in print even as the official engravings continued to depict spacious galleries and untroubled, elegantly dressed visitors moving through them at their leisure. There is something clarifying, at the end of a day this thoroughly examined, in simply naming what has been true the entire time. Victorian Britain built something genuinely wonderful in Hyde Park in the summer of 1851, and it built that wonder on top of an enormous, largely invisible foundation of physical discomfort, quiet endurance, and careful, unglamorous calculation, carried by exactly the people least equipped to complain about it in public and least likely to be remembered for having carried it at all. The building is gone now, lost to a fire nearly a century past, and the crystal fountain that once threw its cooling mist across 6 million upturned faces exists today only in engravings, photographs, and the occasional surviving fragment held in a museum case. Jennings' retiring rooms are gone as well, replaced many times over by the ordinary, unremarkable public conveniences his own innovation eventually made commonplace across the whole of Britain. A legacy so thoroughly absorbed into everyday life that almost nobody using a public lavatory today has any particular reason to think of the man who first proved, at a penny a visit, that London's crowds deserved one worth using. And somewhere in the deep, undocumented background of all of it, a young cabinet maker's wife stood at a threshold on a July morning, corseted, thirsty, quietly nauseated, carrying a secret she had not yet told her own mother, and looked up at 900,000 square feet of glass with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder that nothing about the rest of her long, demanding day would ever fully take away from her. She is not the figure the engravings remembered, the well-dressed crowd moving comfortably through spacious galleries, untroubled by heat or thirst or the ache of a laced bodice by mid-afternoon. She is the person those engravings were never really built to show. The ordinary body inside the extraordinary building, managing what an ordinary body always has to manage, with whatever ingenuity, patience, and quiet endurance the day required of her. And she looks magnificent standing there. Not despite everything the rest of this evening has uncovered about her corset, her queue, her careful shillings, and her private, unspoken fear near the crush at the gate, but directly in the middle of all of it. Exactly as she actually was, a person in a complicated body, in a demanding world, given 1 shilling's worth of wonder and asked to carry the whole of it home again on her own 2 tired feet. The candle has burned low tonight, and the crystal fountain has gone quiet, its mist settled, its glass long since scattered and lost to a fire nobody standing beneath it that July afternoon could have possibly imagined. Somewhere out past the edge of the story, a small family walks the last stretch home through the cooling evening air, footsore, sunburned, already beginning, without quite meaning to remember the day as something lighter and simpler than it actually was. Let them have that. It is, after everything this evening has uncovered, still entirely true. Sleep well.